Hello everybody, welcome to Sane Game Studios. I am Sane, I am an amateur game developer. Today I'm going to be going on a little bit of a rant about controller ergonomics. And when I'm talking about controller ergonomics, I'm talking about how comfortable is your control scheme in the hands of your players. I had the idea for this rant when I was doing my recording for Indie Side episodes 1 and 2, where I did reviews of the indie games Blossom Tales 1 and 2. And the reason why I had this idea for this rant was because the control scheme in those games were god-awful. I'll get into why they were so terrible, but first, I'm going to talk about why control ergonomics are so important. So if you're playing a game and the control scheme is uncomfortable, and when I say it's uncomfortable, I mean that you have to do weird things with your hands in order to hit the proper buttons, or your hands are positioned in awkward positions, so that your arms are resting in an uncomfortable way, you're not going to want to play that game. And as game developers, we want people to not only play our game, we want people to enjoy our game and want to play our game so that our game will hopefully become successful. This is the whole point of building games, is to have them become a success and ideally make a bit of money off of them so that you can make a living making games. You don't have to punch a clock for some dickhead in an office. Right? So one of the things you really need to think of when you're building a game is how comfortable are your controls, and also are there ways that you can make them more comfortable. And if you have a poor control scheme, your game's going to be significantly worse. If you have bad controls, a lot of the time that's going to equal to having a bad game. There definitely are exceptions where games are so good they shine through their controls. But you can say the same thing about soundtracks, right? And then there are games that have very bad controls but still end up being good games, and a great example being Blossom Tales 1 and 2. And that's because they actually gave the player the ability to remap the controls, so we could take their terrible controls and turn them into something better, which was honestly very easy to do because 1, they set it up to make it easy to remap them, and 2, better was a very low bar to achieve. So better was pretty much anything else. Okay, so before I get into what it is that makes games ergonomically comfortable with their control schemes, I'm gonna provide a couple examples of poor control schemes, and the first one I'm going to do is the one I've already been talking about, and that is Blossom Tales 1 and 2. So in Blossom Tales, which is very much a Zelda Link to the Past style game, it's like a top-down action-adventure game, they use the right hand for movement, which is fine. It was a great way for them to do movement. The right hand was purely on the arrow keys, and that worked great. But then the left hand, in the first one, the left hand only had 3 buttons, and that was Z. Some people may say Z. I say Z. I'm Canadian. We use Z. Z, X, and C. And on paper, just those buttons alone, they seem to make sense. They are comfortably where your left hand would sit, and they are all in a row. So you can just put a finger on each of them, and boom, away you go. But they messed up on the assignments. So Z, which was on my left ring finger, was my sword and action button. And then my middle finger and index, which were on X and C, were equipment. And by equipment, I mean bombs, bow and arrow, shields, the boomerang, things that you would use. And the issue with that was, in a game like that, the most common thing that I'm going to be doing is either interacting with something or swinging my sword. So why are you taking the most important common thing that I'm going to be doing and putting it least comfortable finger that you have in play? Why is it that I'm using my left ring finger more than any other finger while playing your game? That should not be a thing. If I'm going to have a button that I'm going to be using constantly, and I mean constantly, the entire combat system was done with one button, right? It should be my index finger or my thumb, because they are very quick, easily, and comfortably accessible. And then another great example of a different way in which control schemes can be uncomfortable is actually in Elden Ring. And Elden Ring itself is an amazing game. If you have not played Elden Ring, I highly recommend that you play Elden Ring. It won tons of awards. It's an amazing game. Their one issue that I found, at least with their control, was the combination of camera and running. And when you're in combat, it's not really something you need to worry about, because you can lock onto the enemy and you can just run around and your camera's taken care of for you, and you can just use your right thumb to dodge and run and roll and do whatever it is that you need to do while not paying any attention to where your camera is, because your camera is always going to be exactly where you need it. However, when I'm running around in the overworld and I'm trying to keep an eye out, to the left and to the right to make sure that I'm not being flanked by, some random enemy coming out of nowhere, because that happens a lot in that game, or I'm trying to keep an eye out for a secret hidden cave entrance, which there's a lot of in that game, right? I should be able to run while I'm looking around. And I couldn't do that because both of those buttons were completely separate from each other, and they both used the right thumb. And in order to achieve this, I actually had to curl my index finger off of the bumper button and bring it down in front of circle, because I play on PlayStation, and I'd use the side of my index finger to hold down the circle button while I looked around with my thumb. And it was just a very awkward thing to do with my hands, and it was really uncomfortable to do. And like I said, absolutely great game. But that one part of the ergonomics of their control scheme was done, in my opinion, rather poorly. So now that we got some examples out of the way, how can you make your controls more comfortable? And the answer to this is simple, but not at the same time. You need to take into consideration what it is that your game is asking your players to do. And then also think about how many buttons does your player need to play your game? How many different functions do they have? How many different mechanics are you providing them with? How many different abilities are you providing with? And then also, how are you assigning those abilities? Do you assign them directly to a button? Do you have it so that the player can assign abilities or equipment to a button, and then they can change what that button does? Or what are you doing with your game? That is the first thing you need to figure out. Then the second thing you need to figure out is, where are your hands going to sit? So if you are using the mouse, for example, and the game's not completely point and click, so you do need to use the keyboard. If you're going to be using the mouse, which vast majority of people are going to be using with their right hand to the far right of their keyboard, their left hand shouldn't be reaching across and using the right side of the keyboard as well. You should be doing something with the left side of the keyboard. And this is why so many first-person shooters, when they're using the mouse to aim and shoot and aim down the sights and stuff like this, they use WASD for movement. And then a lot of them, very smartly, will use the space bar for either interact or for jump. And then that makes sense, because when your hand is over WASD, your thumb is going to rest on the spacebar. So that just makes a lot of sense. So what if you're building a platformer game? Or what if you're building a top-down adventure game like Blossom Tales? So if you're going to have movement with controls that are also on the keyboard, if your entire game's played on the keyboard, in my opinion, you are much better off putting your movement on the arrow keys. So you're using your right hand on the right side of the keyboard for your movement. But then your left hand, you have to figure out where it is that you want your players to position their hand. And then also you need to think about what buttons are readily available at that location. Right? So let's say you have an interact button, and you also have a jump button. Right? So you could absolutely make it so that interact is D, and then your jump button is the space bar, and that has your hand and your index and your thumb resting comfortably at both of those locations. But then you also need to think about, if they're going to be using this button, are there any other buttons that they are also going to be using at the same time? And if the answer is yes, do not, for the love of God, please do not assign both of those buttons to a region that is most comfortably reached by the same finger. Right? If I need to hold down action and then also do something else, then I should be doing the action with my index and then the something else, the alternate, with my middle finger. That way I can hit both buttons comfortably with individual fingers. But then also we need to take in consideration that your players don't want to have to look for the controls. They need to be able to position their hands in a neutral position somewhere on the keyboard, and then have everything be somewhere natural to reach, so that they can keep their eyes focused on the game, not break their immersion. That's a big thing. If they have to look away from the screen, you are breaking the fourth wall of the game, and you are subtracting from the immersion of it. So you need to make it so that your buttons are easy to find and well mapped, so that the player never has to look at what button they are reaching for. There are certain exceptions though. So pause, for example. A lot of games will use escape or P, and those are very out of the way, and you usually have to look at the keyboard to hit them, and you have to completely move your hand. But that is fine, because what they are doing is they are pausing the game. Chances are they are getting up and going to their fridge and grabbing a beer, or they're going to go pet their dog, or they're going to go to the bathroom or something. So they're about to break their immersion anyways. So you can have their immersion break be started by an immersion break, which that's absolutely fine. But all I'm saying is, when you are developing a game, take the time to think about your controls. And also, do not use your temporary controls. This is something I am actually very guilty of when I'm developing games. I will be writing a bunch of code, I'll be building a new mechanic or something, and that new mechanic or that new ability or whatever it is that I'm building needs to be assigned to a button. And it needs to be assigned to a button right now, because I need to test it right now to see if I am done writing code, or if I need to go back and edit it. Chances are edit it, because it's really hard to write perfect code the first time. Let's do something basic like movement. But I was assigned it a button. I'll just be like S, and I'll use S. But then as I continue building the game, I'm going to build another mechanic or another ability. I'm going to have to test that out. And I'm just going to slap that onto D, because that's right there. And by the end of the game, I have all these buttons assigned, and all of my mechanics are assigned, but they're uncomfortable. But I don't realize that they're uncomfortable, because I built them that way, one key at a time, and I got used to my hand being there, and I made a mess of it as I was doing it, but I got used to that mess. It was like organized chaos. But the player jumping in the game for the first time, they're not going to have that sense of organized chaos. They're just going to have the chaos. So when you are done your game, like especially like final tweaks and polishing, take a second and look at your controls and make sure that you are not using your temporary controls, because you might think they're comfortable, but I am definitively telling you right now, they are not. Your temporary controls are not comfortable controls for permanent gameplay for your players. And this I absolutely am sure of. Unless you were one of those weird people. Well, no, I'm not going to say weird because I don't want to insult you, but one of those rare people that thinks about their control scheme right from day one, and you're constantly editing your control scheme, so as you're developing it, you have comfortable controls. That's not really much of a thing. You're usually just assigning a button and testing things out and seeing how it goes, and next thing you know, you have a jumbled mess of control scheme. Right? And that also where testing comes in. You need to put your game in the hands of other people, ideally in front of your eyes. They're usually going to be friends or family members, or that homeless guy down the street who seems like he might be into video games, and you're going to welcome them into your home, and you're going to sit them at your computer, and you're going to be like, play this game, and then you're going to sit there and you're going to watch them play it. It's actually, in my opinion, very important that you watch them play it and keep your mouth shut and let them struggle and figure out what is actually wrong with it. And when someone is testing your game, they're going to ask you what kind of things that they should be looking for while they're testing it. What kind of things and you're always going to have things. You're always going to have things you're unsure of, things that you want to have tested, that you want people's input on. Make sure that when you give that list, when you go on that smaller rant than this about the things that you want your testers to tell you about, make sure you add how comfortable are the controls, because that significantly matters. Like I said, if you have bad controls, chances are you have a bad game, because controls are everything with a game. It is how the player plays your game. It is how they interact with your game. It is how they make the game be a game. Otherwise, it's just a movie that isn't moving because they don't have any controls. Okay, so that should be the end of my rant. I mean, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to thank you very much for tuning into this video, and I'm going to thank you very much for listening to my rant. I hope you enjoyed my rant. I can get very ranty. I probably could have kept going, but this video has to stay a reasonable length, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to say, again, thank you for listening. If you have any input on what I have said, or if you agree or disagree, if you think that, hey, Sane, you're actually a really smart guy, and I appreciate your input on controls that I never thought of, comment that. Let me know. If you think, oh man, you're an absolute moron, you have no idea what you're talking about, you know what? Comment that too. I don't care. Frickin' throw shade at me. But either way, if you like the video or if you have any input, please like, comment, and if you're interested in seeing some game dev tutorials or like on Game Maker Studios, that's what I use for my engine, or if you are interested in seeing more rants like this in the future, or if you are even interested in seeing some independent game reviews, please subscribe to my channel. I'd really appreciate it. I'd like to see you guys in the community commenting on my stuff, watching my videos, because it makes me feel good, you know? So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm going to say thank you again very much for listening, and I hope you guys are having a wonderful day, and peace out.